Daniel Reeves stepped onto his porch that Saturday morning, expecting the same quiet routine Maple Brook Estates had offered since the day he moved in. Coffee in one hand. Sun just starting to warm the street. A couple of neighbors walking their dogs. Nothing unusual. That was the whole reason he chose this neighborhood in the first place. Quiet streets. Predictable mornings. No drama. But the moment he looked down at his front yard, he stopped walking. A black SUV sat squarely on his grass. Not near the curb. Not partly on the driveway. Directly on the lawn. Daniel blinked once, thinking maybe he was seeing something wrong through the early light. But the vehicle didn't move. A polished, oversized luxury SUV, the kind that looked like it belonged in front of a hotel, not on a patch of suburban grass. He took a slow sip of coffee and looked again. The SUV was still there, and standing beside it, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of official badge, was Cynthia Hargrove, president of the Maple Brook Estates, HOA. Cynthia had that same posture she always carried when she walked the neighborhood. Straight back, sunglasses on even when the sun wasn't bright. Clipboard tucked against her arm like she was inspecting a construction site instead of a row of ordinary homes. Daniel had already received 3 notices from her that week alone. Grass height, Treshbin Platzement, the color shade of the mailbox post. 3 notices in 5 days. He had trimmed the lawn the same afternoon the first one arrived. Moved the trash bin behind the fence like the second notice suggested. Even repainted the mailbox post, because apparently the shade of brown he used wasn't exactly what the HOA guidelines preferred. Daniel had done everything they asked. That was the part that bothered him the most. He wasn't trying to fight the rules. He wasn't trying to make trouble. He just wanted to live in peace. But somehow, every time Cynthia walked the block, she ended up stopping in front of his house. Daniel stepped down from the porch slowly, still holding the coffee mug. Cynthia glanced up briefly when she heard the porch creak, but didn't say anything at first. Instead, she made a mark on the paper, clipped to her board. Daniel walked halfway across the lawn before speaking. "Morning." Cynthia tapped the pen twice against the clipboard before responding. "Mr. Reeves." Her tone carried that calm authority she always used when delivering HOA notices. "I'm conducting a compliance inspection this morning." Daniel looked from her to the SUV again. "On my lawn." Cynthia didn't react to the question. She simply glanced down at her notes. "Your grass length was cited earlier this week. I'm verifying that the violation has been corrected." Daniel stared at the SUV tires pressing into the soft soil. "You could have checked that from the sidewalk." Cynthia gave a small sigh, the kind people make when they think they're dealing with someone unreasonable. HOA bylaws allow inspections where necessary. Daniel nodded slowly. He had read those bylaws too, more than once. And he knew one thing they didn't say was that HOA officers could park their vehicles on private lawns. A couple across the street slowed down while walking their dog. They pretended not to stare, but Daniel could feel their eyes flicking back and forth between him and Cynthia. That happened a lot whenever Cynthia was involved. People watched, but no one said anything. Cynthia finished writing on her clipboard and looked back up. "The grass is acceptable now," she said. "However, I noticed your trash receptacle was visible from the street yesterday evening." Daniel set the coffee mug on the edge of the porch railing behind him. "Because it was trash day." Cynthia tilted her head slightly. "The receptacle should be returned behind the fence within 12 hours of collection." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck slowly. He had lived in Maple Brook Estates for just over a month and already knew the rhythm of these conversations. Cynthia would cite another rule, another minor issue, another tiny correction. Daniel would nod, fix it, and move on. That had been the routine, until this morning, because now her SUV was sitting on his lawn like it belonged there. "Cynthia," Daniel said carefully, keeping his voice calm, "could you move your vehicle off the grass?" Cynthia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she flipped to another page on the clipboard. "I'm almost finished here." Daniel glanced down again at the ground beneath the tires. The soil looked darker than the rest of the lawn, slightly softer. He had noticed that patch when a landscaping crew worked there a few weeks earlier. The crew had mentioned something about an old irrigation line that used to run under the yard years ago before the neighborhood was renovated. Daniel had told them to leave that section alone for now, because the ground there never felt quite as firm as the rest of the yard. It hadn't been a problem. Until now. I'd really appreciate it if you moved the SUV, Daniel repeated. Cynthia looked up over the edge of her sunglasses. It will only be a moment. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He simply pointed lightly toward the driveway. There's space right there. Cynthia followed his gesture briefly before returning her attention to the clipboard. Mr. Reeves, HOA officers are authorized to conduct inspections when necessary. Daniel took a breath through his nose and let it out slowly. He had no interest in arguing with Cynthia in the middle of the street while neighbors watched from their sidewalks. That wasn't the kind of person he was. He preferred things simple, direct, quiet. But this was starting to feel less like an inspection and more like something else. Like Cynthia needed to prove something. Another neighbor stepped outside across the street, phone already in hand like he had stepped out to check a message. Daniel knew that look too. People sense tension the way birds sense storms. Cynthia scribbled one last note on her clipboard. Then she tapped the pen against the page and looked up again. Everything appears satisfactory now. Daniel nodded toward the SUV. Then we're done here. Cynthia slid the clipboard under her arm, but didn't move toward the vehicle yet. Instead, she scanned the lawn again like she might find another detail worth writing down. Daniel shifted his weight slightly and looked once more at the ground beneath the front tires. The grass there was pressing lower than the rest. Subtle, but noticeable if you knew what to look for. The earth underneath wasn't packed the same way the rest of the yard was. He had stepped there before and felt it give just slightly under his shoes. Nothing dramatic, just softer. Cynthia took a step toward the SUV door. Then she paused and looked back at Daniel. Before I leave, there's another matter regarding your driveway edge. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second. Just 1/2 second. When he opened them again, he spoke slowly. Cynthia, she stopped mid-sentence. Please move the vehicle off the lawn. For the first time since the conversation began, Cynthia's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a thin line of irritation that crossed her face. She placed the clipboard on the hood of the SUV and reached into her pocket for her phone. I will move it shortly, she said. Daniel didn't answer this time. He simply stood there watching the tires pressing deeper into the grass, while the neighbors across the street pretended very badly not to watch the same thing. A faint sound came from the ground. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small shift beneath the soil, the kind of sound that might go unnoticed if the morning had been quieter. Daniel heard it. His eyes moved to the front wheel. The tire had sunk slightly, maybe 1/2 inch. Cynthia hadn't noticed yet. She was still scrolling through something on her phone. Daniel glanced once more at the ground and then back at Cynthia. You should probably move the SUV now. Cynthia sighed again. Mr. Reeves, I told you, the front tire sank another fraction of an inch into the grass. This time, Cynthia heard it. She looked down quickly. The SUV leaned forward just enough for the chrome grille to tilt toward the lawn. The neighbors across the street stopped pretending not to watch. Daniel folded his arms slowly and looked at the ground beneath the vehicle, because that soft patch of earth under the front tires had just started to move. And in that moment, everyone on the street realized something was about to happen that Maple Brook Estates had never seen before. The tires stopped moving for a moment, as if the ground had decided to hold its breath. Cynthia stared down at it, her brows pulling together slightly behind the sunglasses. The SUV looked perfectly normal at first glance, but the angle of the front bumper was no longer level with the driveway across the street. Daniel noticed it immediately. He had been standing on that lawn enough times to know exactly how flat it was supposed to be. That wasn't like that before, Cynthia muttered quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Daniel kept his arms folded and didn't move closer. I told you the ground there was soft. Cynthia glanced up at him sharply. You said nothing about the ground. Daniel tilted his head slightly. I asked you to move the vehicle. Across the street, the couple with the dog had completely stopped pretending they weren't watching. The dog sat patiently on the sidewalk while its owners stared across the street like they were watching a slow-motion accident unfold. Another neighbor 2 houses down opened his garage halfway and leaned out just far enough to see what was happening. Maple Brook Estates was usually quiet on weekend mornings. Lawns got mowed. Kids rode bikes. Someone washed a car. Nothing dramatic ever happened here, which was probably why people were suddenly very interested in the SUV sitting in Daniel's yard. Cynthia stepped closer to the front wheel and crouched slightly, examining the grass. The tire had pressed deeper than before. The earth underneath looked darker now, almost damp. "That's strange," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah." Cynthia stood back up quickly, brushing a small piece of grass from her pant leg. "Did you do something to the ground here?" The question came out sharper than before. Daniel didn't react. "Do something? You said the soil was soft," Cynthia said. "Did you dig here recently?" Daniel almost laughed, but caught himself. "No." Cynthia crossed her arms now, mirroring Daniel's posture without realizing it. "Because this doesn't look normal." Daniel looked down at the lawn again. "It's been like that since before I moved in." Cynthia glanced toward the neighbors watching from the sidewalk, then back at Daniel. For a moment, she seemed unsure what to do next. The SUV was still running, the engine humming quietly. Daniel could hear it under the tension, hanging in the air. "You should move the vehicle," Daniel said again, calm but firm. Cynthia reached for the door handle. Just as she pulled it open, the ground shifted again. This time it wasn't subtle. The front of the SUV dropped another inch with a dull crunch from beneath the soil. Cynthia froze halfway into the driver's seat. The neighbors across the street gasped quietly. Daniel watched the tire slowly sink deeper into the grass. "Okay," Cynthia said quickly, climbing fully into the seat now. She slammed the door and put the vehicle into reverse. The engine revved slightly. The SUV didn't move. Cynthia pressed the accelerator again. The tire spun once against the soft ground, but the vehicle barely shifted. Instead, the front wheel dug deeper, the grass folding inward around the rubber like the earth was swallowing it. Daniel took one slow step back from the lawn. "Stop." Cynthia let off the gas and looked through the windshield at him. "It's stuck." "Yeah," Daniel replied. The neighbors had moved closer now, slowly drifting toward the curb like people approaching a street performer. Phones appeared in a few hands. No one said anything out loud yet, but the curiosity in the air was obvious. Cynthia opened the door again and stepped out, looking at the wheel. The tire was buried almost halfway into the lawn now. "That wasn't like that 5 minutes ago," she said, her voice tight. Daniel shrugged lightly. "The ground's been unstable there for years." "Years?" Cynthia snapped. "You didn't mention that." Daniel looked at her evenly. "You didn't ask." Cynthia stared at him for a long second. "You should have warned me." Daniel didn't respond right away. He simply gestured toward the driveway again. "I asked you twice to move the SUV." That answer hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Across the street, someone quietly whispered something that made another neighbor chuckle under their breath. Cynthia heard it. Her jaw tightened slightly. The authority she usually carried around the neighborhood suddenly felt thinner. She turned away from Daniel and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling a tow service," she said. Daniel nodded. "Probably a good idea." Cynthia dialed quickly and turned slightly, so her back faced the growing audience on the sidewalk. "Yes, I need assistance with a vehicle that's stuck," she said into the phone. "Front lawn, Maple Brook Estates." Daniel glanced around the street now. More people had appeared. One neighbor stood on his porch pretending to sweep while staring directly at the SUV. Another leaned out from behind a mailbox, clearly recording with their phone. Daniel sighed quietly. This wasn't how he imagined spending his Saturday morning. He had planned to fix a loose hinge on the back gate and maybe run to the hardware store. Instead, he was standing in his front yard watching the president of the HOA try to explain why her SUV was halfway inside his lawn. Cynthia ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Tow truck is on the way." Daniel nodded once. "Good." Cynthia glanced down again at the tire. The soil around it had begun to crack slightly, like the weight of the vehicle was pressing into something hollow underneath. She crouched again and brushed aside a patch of grass with her hand. Beneath the roots, the dirt looked loose and uneven. "What's under here?" she asked. Daniel answered honestly. "Old irrigation line." Cynthia looked up. "What?" "There used to be a sprinkler system installed before the neighborhood was renovated," Daniel said. "The landscaping company told me the pipes were removed years ago, but some cavities stayed under the soil." Cynthia straightened slowly. And you didn't think that was important to mention? Daniel's voice stayed even. It wasn't a problem until a 2.5-ton SUV parked on top of it. The neighbor with the dog coughed awkwardly, clearly trying not to laugh. Cynthia shot a glare in their direction before turning back to Daniel. You could have placed a marker or something. Daniel raised an eyebrow. On my own lawn. Cynthia opened her mouth to reply, but stopped. Because at that exact moment, the ground shifted again. The front end of the SUV dipped another inch. The sound of soil collapsing faint but unmistakable. A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd forming along the curb. Daniel looked at the lawn carefully now. The grass near the tire was starting to sink inward like a shallow crater forming around the wheel. You should step back, he said calmly. Cynthia didn't argue this time. She moved a few steps away from the SUV, watching it like someone watching a chair with a broken leg. For a moment, nothing happened. The vehicle sat there quietly, tilted slightly forward, the engine still humming. Then a deep, muffled crack echoed under the soil. The front wheel dropped again, not a little this time. Nearly half the tire disappeared beneath the lawn in one slow, unsettling motion. Gasps rose from the neighbors. Someone whispered, "Oh, wow." Cynthia's composure finally cracked. "What is happening?" she demanded. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the lawn, remembering what the landscaping contractor had said a few weeks earlier. Something about underground drainage cavities collapsing under pressure. He had never worried about it, because nothing heavy ever sat on that part of the yard. Until today. Cynthia stepped closer again, clearly unsure whether to panic or stay calm. "This is your property," she said sharply. "You're responsible for maintaining safe ground conditions." Daniel looked at her. "You parked on private property without permission." The words landed harder than Daniel expected. Even the neighbors went quiet. Cynthia's lips pressed together. She looked around briefly, noticing for the first time just how many people were watching now. Phones raised. Curious faces. People who had spent years quietly accepting her strict rule enforcement suddenly had front row seats to something very different. Authority slipping, control wobbling, and the ground under a $100,000 SUV continuing to sink. The front of the vehicle creaked softly as the suspension shifted under the uneven weight. Daniel folded his arms again. "Tow truck better get here soon." Cynthia stared at the SUV like it might move on its own if she watched it closely enough. But the ground beneath Maple Brook Estates had already decided otherwise. And the longer the vehicle sat there, the deeper the earth seemed ready to pull it down. By the time 5 minutes passed, half the street knew something strange was happening in front of Daniel Ree's house. Maple Brook Estates wasn't the kind of place where excitement happened often, so when it did, it traveled quickly. A car slowed at the end of the block, the driver leaning slightly forward over the wheel to see what everyone else was looking at. A teenager rolled past on a bicycle and nearly forgot to keep pedaling when he spotted the SUV sinking into the grass. Daniel noticed more people gathering, but he kept his attention on the vehicle. The front wheel had already disappeared deep enough that the rim was nearly touching the soil. The SUV leaned forward now in a way that made it obvious something under the ground had given way. Cynthia stood a few feet away with her arms folded, staring at the lawn as if sheer authority could force the earth to behave. The clipboard was still resting on the hood where she had left it earlier, sliding slightly toward the windshield because the vehicle was no longer level. "The tow truck said 20 minutes, she said stiffly without looking at Daniel. Daniel nodded once. "Might want to hope the ground holds that long." Cynthia shot him a quick glare, but didn't respond. Instead, she paced slowly around the front of the SUV, examining the lawn from different angles like she was searching for proof that this situation wasn't actually happening. The soil around the tire continued to sink in small increments, tiny cracks spreading outward through the grass like thin lines in dry paint. Daniel had seen soil behave like that once before when a drainage trench collapsed behind his old apartment building years ago. The ground looked stable right until the moment it wasn't. "You're sure this has nothing to do with anything you installed recently?" Cynthia asked again. Daniel shook his head calmly. "I haven't touched that part of the yard." Cynthia crouched once more, and pressed her palm lightly against the grass near the tire. The earth gave slightly under her hand. She quickly pulled it back like she had touched something hot. This entire section feels unstable. Daniel looked down at the same spot. That's what I was trying to tell you earlier. Cynthia stood up and brushed her hands together sharply. You should have put up some kind of warning. Daniel sighed quietly. It's a front lawn, not a construction site. A soft chuckle escaped from somewhere behind the crowd on the curb. Cynthia heard it immediately. Her shoulders stiffened. For years she had walked this neighborhood, issuing rules and reminders and notices with complete confidence. She had always been the person telling others what they needed to fix. Now she stood in the middle of the street with a crowd, watching while her SUV slowly disappeared into someone's yard. The shift in that dynamic was impossible not to notice. Daniel could see it on her face, even if she tried to hide it. Another faint sound came from the ground beneath the vehicle. This time it wasn't just a shift. It was a deeper crack, like something hollow collapsing under pressure. The SUV lurched forward slightly. A ripple of murmurs moved through the small group of neighbors. Someone lifted their phone higher to get a clearer angle. Cynthia turned toward the vehicle quickly. Did you hear that? Daniel nodded. Yeah. The front bumper dipped another inch. The grass around the tire folded inward again as the soil underneath compressed further. The SUV was now tilted enough that the back wheels looked noticeably higher than the front. Cynthia stepped closer, clearly unsure whether she should intervene or stay back. Should we try moving it again? She asked. Daniel shook his head immediately. If you spin the tires now, it'll probably make it worse. Cynthia hesitated, then stepped back again. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown to nearly 10 people. A few whispered conversations floated through the air as everyone tried to understand what they were seeing. Maple Brook Estates had rules for almost everything. Fence height, lawn maintenance, mailbox color. But there definitely wasn't a rule about SUVs disappearing into lawns. Cynthia crossed her arms again and stared at the vehicle. This is going to cause property damage. Daniel glanced at the lawn. Yeah, your lawn. Daniel shrugged slightly. It can be repaired. Cynthia turned sharply toward him. But the vehicle, she stopped herself mid-sentence, because another deep crack echoed under the soil. This one was louder, the kind of sound that made people instinctively step backward. The SUV shifted again, the front wheel sinking even deeper. Now almost the entire tire had vanished beneath the grass. Gasps spread through the neighbors watching from the curb. Daniel instinctively moved another step back toward the porch. Everyone should probably give it some space, he said calmly. A few people nodded and took a step away from the lawn. Cynthia remained where she was, eyes fixed on the SUV like she couldn't quite believe it was happening. This is unbelievable, she muttered. Daniel tilted his head slightly. You don't see that every morning. The comment wasn't sarcastic. It was simply true. Cynthia turned toward him again, frustration creeping into her voice. You seem awfully calm about this. Daniel met her gaze evenly. I asked you not to park there. The sentence landed quietly but heavily. Cynthia didn't answer. Instead, she looked back at the SUV again, just as another piece of ground collapsed beneath it. The front end dropped several more inches in one slow motion. The hood angled downward toward the grass like the vehicle was bowing. The clipboard slid completely off the hood and fell to the ground with a soft plastic clatter. The neighbors reacted immediately. Someone let out a surprised laugh. Another voice whispered, "Oh man." Cynthia stepped forward instinctively, but Daniel lifted a hand slightly. "Don't." She stopped. For the first time since arriving that morning, uncertainty had fully replaced her earlier confidence. The ground beneath the SUV no longer looked like solid lawn. It looked like a shallow crater forming beneath the front half of the vehicle. The grass was folding inward as if the soil underneath had turned to loose sand. The sound of an approaching truck engine echoed faintly from the far end of the street. Daniel turned his head slightly. A tow truck was slowly rolling toward the crowd. The driver leaned forward over the wheel, trying to see what kind of situation he had been called to handle. When the truck finally reached Daniel's house, it slowed to a stop beside the curb. The driver stepped out and looked at the SUV for a long second before speaking. "Well," he said. That's a new one. A few neighbors chuckled softly. Cynthia walked quickly toward him. The vehicle became stuck due to unstable ground conditions, she said, her voice snapping back into a more official tone now that someone else had arrived. The tow driver nodded slowly and walked closer to the lawn. He studied the angle of the SUV and the depth of the tire buried in the grass. Then he crouched and pressed his hand lightly against the soil. The ground sank slightly under the pressure. He stood back up immediately. Yeah, that's not just stuck, he said. The ground underneath collapsed. Cynthia crossed her arms again. Can you pull it out? The driver scratched the side of his head while looking at the vehicle. Eventually, yeah. But if I hook it right now, the whole front end might sink deeper. Cynthia's expression tightened. So what do we do? The tow driver gestured toward the SUV. First, we stabilize the ground around it. Otherwise, the weight's just going to keep pushing it down. As if the earth wanted to prove his point, another muffled crack sounded beneath the lawn. The SUV dipped again, this time enough that the front bumper nearly touched the grass. The crowd reacted instantly with a mix of gasps and nervous laughter. Cynthia looked back at the vehicle, and for the first time that morning, she seemed genuinely shaken. Daniel stood quietly near the porch, watching the entire scene unfold with the same calm patience he had shown since the beginning. Because the moment he had asked Cynthia to move the SUV off the lawn, he had already known the ground under that tire was softer than it looked. What he hadn't known was just how soft it really was. And now everyone in Maplebrook Estates was learning that lesson together as the earth beneath Cynthia Hargrove's SUV continued to give way. The tow truck driver walked slowly around the front of the SUV, studying the lawn with the careful attention of someone who had learned that ground could lie. From the sidewalk, it still looked like a normal yard. Green grass, even surface, quiet suburban landscaping. But standing close enough, the problem was obvious. The front half of the vehicle had sunk so deep that the bumper was nearly brushing the grass. The soil around the tire wasn't just soft anymore. It had collapsed inward, forming a shallow bowl beneath the wheel. The driver knelt down again and pressed the edge of his boot into the ground near the crater. The dirt shifted immediately. He stood up quickly and wiped his hands on his jeans. Yeah, he said, that cavity under there is bigger than I thought. Cynthia crossed her arms tightly. Can you pull it out or not? The driver glanced at her, then back at the SUV. Not yet. Why not? Because if I hook it right now, he said, pointing toward the front axle, the weight's going to pull the whole front end deeper before it even moves. Cynthia's voice sharpened. That vehicle is worth over $100,000. The driver shrugged slightly. And gravity doesn't care. A few neighbors chuckled quietly behind them. Cynthia turned her head sharply toward the crowd, clearly irritated by the reaction. Daniel remained where he had been for most of the morning, standing near the edge of his porch steps with his arms folded loosely. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. If anything, he looked like someone watching a situation that had gotten bigger than anyone expected. The tow driver walked back to his truck and pulled out a pair of thick boards along with a shovel. First thing we need to do is stabilize the ground around that wheel, he explained. Otherwise, every time we move the vehicle, it'll just sink more. Cynthia watched him closely. How long will that take? The driver shrugged again. Depends how much ground collapsed under there. As if on cue, another deep crack sounded from beneath the lawn. This one was louder than before. The soil shifted again, and the front end of the SUV dropped several more inches in a slow, heavy motion that made the entire vehicle rock slightly. The crowd reacted instantly. Someone muttered, "Whoa." Another neighbor lifted their phone higher to keep the vehicle in frame. Cynthia stepped back quickly, her confidence finally cracking through the calm authority she had carried all morning. "Is it still moving?" she asked. The tow driver leaned closer to inspect the ground. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That cavity's still collapsing." Daniel watched the tire slowly disappear deeper into the lawn. Only the top edge of the rubber was visible now. Everything else had been swallowed by the earth beneath it. The driver grabbed the shovel and began carefully digging around the side of the tire, clearing away the loose grass and dirt that had folded inward. Each scoop revealed more empty space beneath the surface. "You've got a hollow pocket under here," he said after a moment. Cynthia looked down into the shallow hole forming beside the wheel. The soil wasn't packed at all anymore. Beneath the thin layer of grass, the ground looked like it had simply fallen away. "How big is it?" she asked. The driver stuck the shovel handle down into the hole to measure the depth. The metal sank almost halfway before hitting solid resistance. He whistled softly. "Bigger than I thought." A ripple of murmurs passed through the neighbors watching. Cynthia ran a hand through her hair, frustration finally visible in her expression. "This is unacceptable." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. The tow driver leaned the shovel against the truck and walked back toward the SUV again. "All right," he said. "Here's the plan." Cynthia looked up quickly. "Good. I'm going to wedge these boards under the tire to spread the weight," the driver explained. "Then I'll hook the front and slowly pull it out." Cynthia nodded impatiently. "Fine. Just do it." The driver lifted the first board and carefully slid it under the edge of the buried tire. The wood creaked slightly as it pressed against the soft ground. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the soil shifted again. Another deep, hollow crack echoed beneath the lawn. The board suddenly tilted downward as the dirt under it collapsed. The SUV lurched forward again, the bumper finally touching the grass. A loud collective gasp came from the crowd. Cynthia stepped backward another 2 steps, her eyes wide now. "Why does it keep doing that?" she demanded. The tow driver shook his head slowly. "Because the ground under that lawn is giving out." Daniel looked down at the same patch of earth he had walked across dozens of times since moving into the house. It had always felt slightly different than the rest of the yard. Softer, unstable, but he had never imagined something this dramatic could happen. The driver set the second board aside and wiped sweat from his forehead. "We need to move fast before the whole front axle drops into that cavity." Cynthia stared at the SUV again. The once polished front grille was now inches from the soil, streaked with mud from the collapsing ground beneath it. The clipboard she had left on the hood earlier lay forgotten in the grass nearby. One of the neighbors picked it up and handed it back to her quietly. Cynthia accepted it without saying a word. The driver attached a thick steel hook to the front frame of the SUV and ran the cable back to his truck. The winch motor hummed to life as he tested the tension. The cable tightened slowly, stretching across the lawn like a silver line. "All right," he called out. "Everyone stay back." The small crowd instinctively moved a few steps farther away from the lawn. Daniel stepped off the porch and joined them near the sidewalk. Cynthia remained near the front of the vehicle, watching every movement closely. "Ready?" the driver asked. She nodded once. The winch began pulling. At first, the SUV didn't move. The cable tightened further, vibrating under the strain. The driver increased the power slightly. The vehicle shifted a fraction of an inch. For a brief moment, it looked like the plan might actually work. Then the ground beneath the front axle gave way completely. The collapse happened fast this time. The soil under the SUV suddenly sank several inches in one heavy motion, dropping the front half of the vehicle deeper into the lawn. The cable jerked violently as the weight shifted. The tow driver slammed the control switch off immediately. The street fell silent. Everyone stared at the SUV, now buried almost halfway to the front doors. Cynthia looked like someone trying to process a reality that didn't match what she expected. "That wasn't supposed to happen," she said quietly. The driver let out a slow breath. "That cavity's bigger than any of us thought." Daniel crossed his arms again, studying the scene in front of him. A few more neighbors had arrived during the last few minutes, drawn by the unusual sight. Phones continued recording from different angles. The moment had become something people will be talking about in Maple Brook Estates for a long time. Cynthia turned slowly toward Daniel. For the first time since the morning began, there was no authority left in her voice. Only frustration. This could have been avoided. Daniel looked at her calmly. "You could have parked on the driveway." The statement landed quietly, but several people in the crowd nodded under their breath. Cynthia looked away, staring back at the SUV, now resting awkwardly inside Daniel's lawn. The driver shut off the winch and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "We're going to need another truck," he said, "and probably some excavation to stabilize the ground." Cynthia's shoulders sagged slightly. Daniel glanced back at the yard once more. The earth had swallowed nearly half of a luxury SUV in less than half an hour. And standing there among the neighbors watching, everyone in Maple Brook Estates could feel it. Something had shifted that morning. Not just the ground beneath the lawn. The balance of power in the neighborhood had changed too. And no clipboard in the world was going to put it back the way it had been before. The street stayed quiet for a few seconds after the collapse. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone is trying to process something unexpected at the same time. The SUV sat tilted forward in the center of Daniel's lawn, the front half buried deep enough that the bumper had nearly vanished beneath the grass. The polished black paint that had looked so pristine earlier that morning was now streaked with dirt and crushed blades of grass. The tow truck driver rubbed the back of his neck and looked from the vehicle to the ground around it. "All right," he said slowly. "We're going to need to change the approach." Cynthia stood a few feet away holding her clipboard, but the object that had seemed so important earlier now looked almost meaningless in her hands. "How long will it take?" she asked. The driver shrugged. "Hard to say. I got another truck coming. We'll stabilize the ground and pull it out carefully." Cynthia glanced at the crowd of neighbors still watching from the sidewalk. The moment had shifted in a way she clearly hadn't anticipated when she parked on the lawn that morning. For years, she had been the one standing in front of houses with that clipboard, pointing out violations, reminding people about rules, speaking with the calm authority of someone who believed the neighborhood depended on order. Now she stood there while the entire block watched her SUV disappear into someone else's yard. Daniel stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the sidewalk where the neighbors had gathered. A few people nodded to him quietly as he joined them. One man shook his head with a small smile. "Didn't think we'd ever see something like that here." Daniel glanced back at the lawn. "Me neither." The tow driver returned to his truck and began preparing additional equipment, while another service vehicle turned onto the street a few minutes later. The second driver stepped out, looked at the scene, and let out a low whistle. "That's going to take some work." The two men began talking quietly as they planned the extraction. They laid down wide boards across the soft ground to distribute the weight, carefully digging around the buried front wheel to prevent the cavity from collapsing further. Each movement was slow and deliberate now. The earlier tension had shifted into careful problem-solving. Cynthia remained mostly silent while the work began. Occasionally, she glanced toward the neighbors still standing nearby. Their expressions weren't hostile, but they were attentive in a way that made it clear the moment wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. Daniel watched the process calmly. He didn't say much, only stepping forward once to answer a question about where the irrigation line had once run beneath the yard. The drivers worked steadily, reinforcing the ground with boards and gravel brought from the truck. Nearly 40 minutes passed before they were finally ready to try pulling the vehicle again. "All right," the first driver said, tightening the cable across the lawn. "Let's do this slow." The winch motor hummed again. This time the SUV moved gradually as the reinforced boards supported the weight. The front end lifted inch by inch, mud and loose soil sliding away from the buried tire. The entire crowd watched in silence as the vehicle slowly climbed out of the crater that had formed beneath it. Finally, the tire emerged fully from the hole with a heavy sucking sound as the vacuum of mud released its grip. A small cheer broke out from the neighbors. The SUV rolled backward onto the driveway where the ground was solid again. The winch stopped and the cable loosened. The drivers inspected the vehicle quickly. The bumper was scratched and the undercarriage caked with dirt, but otherwise it appeared intact. Cynthia stood beside the SUV, looking at it for a long moment before turning toward Daniel. The tension that had filled the morning had drained away, leaving behind something quieter. "I'll have the lawn repaired," she said. Daniel shook his head gently. "It's fine." Cynthia glanced down at the large crater left in the grass. The shape of the hole looked like a scar across the front yard, the soft earth still settling slowly around the edges. "Still," she said, "it shouldn't have happened."